Australia's housing stock is growing more slowly than its population. Back before 2000, and especially before the 1970s, we consistently built enough new homes to facilitate our nation's diverse and growing population. But now, we consistently fail to do so. The top line is this: a failure of Australian policymaking has meant that we have failed to build enough new homes in the places where people most want to live. And the result? House prices have exploded, from 4 times median income in the early 2000s to more than 8 times today. In Sydney, the median home costs more than 10 times the median household income. And the problem isn't just about affordability. It's about the fundamental engines of the modern Australian economy, our cities. I'm Jonathan O'Brien, Editor-in-Chief at Inflection Points, and welcome to the Inflection Points podcast. Today, we're asking a deceptively simple question. If we know what's causing the housing crisis, why don't we just fix it? Brendan Coates is the Housing and Economic Security Program Director at the Grattan Institute. He has just released what may be the most comprehensive analysis of Australian planning reform ever produced, a report that shows exactly how much our planning rules add to the cost of housing and exactly what state and federal governments can do about it. His argument cuts through decades of deflection. The problem isn't immigration, it isn't bank lending, it isn't developers sitting on approvals. It's that our planning systems say no to housing by default and yes only by exception. About 80% of residential land within 30 kilometres of Sydney CBD is restricted to housing of 3 stories or less. In Melbourne, it's 87%. The solutions are straightforward. End the bans. Allow 3-story townhouses and apartments on all residential land. Permit 6-story developments around transit hubs. Cut the red tape that makes even the simplest developments take almost a year to approve. And use federal dollars to push states toward reform, the same way national competition policy transformed the Australian economy in the 1990s. From Auckland's success story to the politics of heritage overlays, from the economics of excess developer profits to whether we actually have the workers to build more, this is a conversation about the biggest microeconomic reform opportunity Australia has today. A bit of disclosure up top. Brendan is on my board at YIMBY Melbourne, which means he's also my boss sometimes, and I also made some research contributions to the report on which this article is based. But let me assure you, the report is good despite me, not because of me. And now, with that out of the way, here is Brendan Coates. Brendan Coates, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan.
You've been working on housing at Grattan for over a decade now, which means that you're old. But it also means that you've been in the housing policy game for a long time. Grattan published its first housing report in 2011. That was The Housing We'd Choose. And that measured people's preferences against available stock. It found, no surprises, a measurable shortfall in denser homes closer to the city centre. Your first bit of housing, tangentially, was property taxes in 2015 with John Daly, where you made the case for broad-based property tax. Going back and reading that, you laid out the revenue of a tax on the median Sydney home. First question of the show. Can you guess the median Sydney home price in 2015?
I'm going to guess $870,000.
Today's dollars or then dollars?
Oh, well, whatever it was in the report at the time, because that's probably what I had in my mind.
It was $772,000.
Well, not too far off.
Not too far off. That's $995,000 in today's dollars, well short of the actual median price today, approaching $1.3 million. So those are the stakes we're playing with. And now for an actual real question and not a gotcha. Since that first foray into housing policy over the past decade, what in your thinking has shifted most radically in the area of housing policy?
Well, I think the work that I did that most influenced how I thought about housing early on was the work for our 2018 report, Housing Affordability, Reimagining the Australian Dream, which weighed up all these different ways of thinking about housing or all these different policy options that you might conceivably use to make housing more affordable. And it was essentially a prioritisation exercise. And at the time, we identified rightly that urban infill was, and supply, first of all, and secondly, urban infill were the keys to getting more housing, that they were the policies that, you know, if you rank things by how big your impact they're going to have on house prices, so prices and rents, how big impact they would have on the other things we care about, so whether it be budget sustainability, whether it be economic growth, whether it be sort of measures of broadly defined social cohesion, that allowing more housing where people most want to live was the number one. I think what has changed over time was at the time we didn't have the visibility of exactly how planning systems worked in detail. I think the housing policy discourse in Australia has gone from a world of, a decade and a half ago recognizing that supply was key, to a decade ago recognizing that there was something in planning systems that was causing this problem to emerge. And you can see this in the work of Ed Glazier and others, Peter Tulip's work applied to Australia. But what wasn't as clear is how much of this was process and, NIMBYism, basically the politics of NIMBYism, local councils saying no to new housing and then those that would move in don't get a say. Versus I think where we are now is it's actually the rules that say no. It's the black and the white rather than process measures. It's not about how quickly you get the permit. It's the fact that we've banned more density across most of Australia's cities, and that is the number one reason why we don't have more housing in the places where people most want to live.
Right, is because it is illegal to do. And if it's illegal to do something, it won't happen.
Yeah, and that required economists to get into the actual rules. So that's kind of where our work's gone now. Andrew Lee said to me once in the context, I think, of our work on migration, that it's much more useful to be the first economist in the room than the 50th. And I think that's a rule that we've applied across lots of different policy areas. Not to say economics is the only discipline you want to have, but where if you have that skill set, you're likely to be most valuable, is looking at areas that are unexplored, looking at areas where that framework around how these trade-offs play out, how you measure cost, how you weigh costs and benefits, the systemic sort of tools, the tools that are used by economists in the discipline, how they could be most usefully deployed to sort of improve public policy.
That actually leads exactly into this next question, which is about being an economist by training. The old Oscar Wilde line gets put on economists that the price of everything and the value of nothing. Rightly or wrongly, planning debates are full of fuzzy signifiers, questions of values, ephemeral, subjective things, right? You've got character, heritage, community, density, quote unquote, done well. But housing affordability is rents. It's price to income ratios, it's vacancy rates. On the one hand, we have the very material and the very immaterial. What's the best way you've found to kind of approach these tensions as an economist, both in public discourse, but also behind the scenes, talking with either other economists, planners, bureaucrats, ministers?
Well, I should also say, Jono, I was a reluctant economist. So I was an arts graduate who studied economics, who eventually acknowledged to myself that I was an economist when it was in my job title, when I was at the World Bank. So I come to this probably more from thinking more about the values and less about the prices. Mm-hmm. And I think where we are now is the value of the work has often been in showing that the costs of the trade-offs or choices that we're making. I think that's central to what Grattan does, and it's central to what my work has been, is that there are values that overlay everything that we do, but at its heart, we're basically telling people or trying to demonstrate what are the costs of different benefits of different options. It's been that case in the migration work, it's been the case in housing, and to just be systematic about if you pull this lever, what's going to happen. Now, economists are probably not great at talking about the broader motivations that a lot of other people have when they come to housing policy. So, economics can be very dry. It can be about prices and rents. I think where the conversation has gone, and I think YIMBY Melbourne has been a big part of that, and the YIMBY groups generally, is colouring in the rest of the picture. That if you think of our most recent work, which I'm sure we'll come to in a little bit, more homes, better cities, I think historically we focused on more homes. I think where that conversation has been rounded at is that it's also about better cities. It's about better designed buildings. It's about a better streetscape that generates social cohesion and walkability, and that people value these things. And so you have to tap into the whole story. Whereas our old work, I think, focused much more just on prices and rents, which meant it was very persuasive to, say, treasuries, but not as persuasive as it could have been in thinking about, the broad sort of coalition of interests that are interested in getting better cities and more housing. How can you mobilize those? And I think that's what the more recent work has tried to do.
Yeah. So what is the kind of ideal story that you want to tell, I guess, about the future Australian city, and why is it important to talk about this future of the city in particular?
Well, it probably starts with a sort of a classical liberal idea, which is that you should allow people to make the choices that they value, to quote kind of Amartya Sen, right? The sort of globally renowned development economist that I first learned about when I went to the Treasury in Canberra, because that's kind of how they think about public policy, from when Ken Henry was the secretary. So you want to allow people to make the choices they want to make, because they're best placed to make those choices. But that also leads to a city that is where housing is affordable, where it is abundant, to use the catchphrase of the moment. But also it generates all these other really positive benefits for how people want to live their lives. It results in higher incomes. It results in, more walkable neighborhoods, greater social connection between people, lower carbon emissions. So you need to tell a story about housing that is really about or how our cities should be that is positive and is capturing tapping into all the things that people care about when they think about, well, should this development go up in my city? What's it going to do? What am I motivated by? And they're motivated by the broad vision and the broad ideal of what their neighborhood's going to look like over the next 30 years.
Yeah, because that's fundamentally kind of the core of where they live, what their opportunities are going to be. But cities are also sort of the engines of the Australian economy in a way that kind of probably, would you say it's fair to say, has not been part of our national narrative up to this point?
Yeah, I think Australia has not understood, Australian policymakers and Australian discussion for a city that, for a country that is so urbanised, has not recognised that, as Elaine Bateau would say, cities are giant labour markets. This is the cornerstone of our economic prosperity and productivity, is the fact that people can bunch together, realise the opportunities of being in close proximity to other people to generate new ideas, to find new suppliers and new customers. For a country that is so urbanised, the way that we think of or conceive of ourselves has not caught up with that until recently. We went from a world of, Banjo Patterson and, the bush, to a world of suburban utopia of the quarter-acre block. And our national conception of ourselves is only just starting to, I think, now catch up with the fact that we are a nation of people that largely, not exclusively, but largely live in cities. And that living in cities is a good thing, has been a good thing for society. It's been a good thing for people. Look, I grew up in country towns. They're great places to live, but I couldn't find a job that I'd like to do in those places. And the trade-off is you come to the city, you can earn the income that you want, like earn an income, be prosperous, and live a good life.
One of the most striking facts, I think, that you sort of throw into the essay is comparing the density of Melbourne and Los Angeles. Very much a city that kind of, for a lot of people, indicates the endless American suburban sprawl. But actually the case is not that. The case is that Australia, a very urbanized country, actually has our second largest city, much less dense than LA. Do you think part of why we don't consider ourselves an urbanized nation is that we've kind of built our cities in this very uncity-like manner?
Yeah, we've kind of tried to overcome the classic idea of the tyranny of distance by grouping into cities, but we've created our own tyranny of distance within cities. I remember when I, studied briefly abroad in Salamanca, coming home and walking the streets of Melbourne, in the inner north, which is comparatively quite a dense area of Melbourne, and just thinking, where is everyone, right? Like where you just felt so separated from your neighbours compared to those European cities. But yeah, Australian cities historically, they just are not very dense. We are global outliers in that respect compared to countries, as you say, or cities like Los Angeles, like Houston, which are known globally. They are synonymous with the idea of car-led urban sprawl, and we are less dense than them. And that is not because of people's preferences, although certainly there's strong preferences for people for freestanding homes where they can afford them and still work and find the work they want to do. It's because we've basically made policy choices to ban options that would allow for more urban infill. Let's
dig into that a little bit. The opening kind of statement of the report is that in the 2000s onward, Australia's housing stock is growing more slowly than its adult population. We've always had housing cycles. What's different now?
What's different is we're not building enough housing to meet the needs of a growing population. And we focus on adults to sort of get rid of there's a lot of demographic noise about, different countries have different birth rates of kids, or people are of different ages. And that does affect cross-country comparisons of how much housing you need per person per se. But to focus on adults, because that's household formation, if you're not an adult, you're unlikely to be wanting to ever form your own household and find your own home. But beyond that, what we saw is that over time in the past, through the 70s, 80s and 90s, through the second half of the last century, we built enough housing to meet not just the demand arising from demographics, from an increase in number of adults, but from rising incomes, from the fact that we had rising rates of divorce, which means more people are living separately. Population aging means people are more likely to live on their own. Say one member of a couple passes away and the other person's a widow or a widower living in their own home. All those things add to demand for housing. And what's really striking is up until the turn of the century, we built enough housing to meet that demand, not just from population, but from those other sources. And since the turn of the century, housing construction has only just kept up pace, barely with the adult population, if that. And you think of all these other sources of demand, they didn't turn off in 2000. And that's, you put that together and you get, it's easy to pull out numbers that say we have a shortage of 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million homes compared to if those kind of trends had continued.
The 2000 number, I think, might have some people thinking about a certain other marker that gets thrown around a little bit, which is changes to negative gearing, capital gains, other tax settings that happened around 99, 2000. Why does your report not focus on those as a kind of part of that turning point?
Well, basically, because the previous work we talked about, the prioritization exercise, just showed they're not that important. So, the way to think about the impact of those tax policies on prices today is to assume that the total value of those concessions, what they're worth to the people that benefit from them, is priced into the value of, the asset that, you're using to purchase them. And you put that together, and if you got rid of the capital gains tax discount, so you halve the capital gains tax discount and you abolish negative gearing in the sense that you no longer allowed, rental losses to be offset against, wage and salary income to reduce the tax, the budget savings are about $10 billion. You scale that up compared to an 11, I think we might even be encroaching on a $12 trillion housing market, and the effect on prices is 1% at most. I think what's telling about that sort of cultural meme is it happened at a time where people are confusing correlation with causation. We saw lots of people buy investment properties at that time. So it has clearly, I think, had an impact on the rate of home ownership. But that's not the same thing as saying it's had a huge enduring impact on prices. And in fact, there's some good work out of New South Wales Treasury that shows if you did what we would like to do, so you halve the discount and curb negative gearing, you would see home ownership rates rise by about 3 percentage points, which is basically the decline I think we've seen in home ownership across Australia over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades. So you'd reverse that decline. But the impact on prices is tiny because an investor, if they're willing to spend 20 grand less on a house or 10 grand less on a $1 million house, that's 1%. Over time, fewer of those investors would win out against home buyers. So it's just a distraction. I think those changes would be good policy. They would be good tax policy, but they're mainly good policy on tax policy grounds. We tax the return to savings really concessionally in Australia. It disadvantages young people. It means we have high rates of personal income tax, which affect workers more. It means it's adding to sort of the wealth inequality story in Australia because most of those concessions go to the wealthiest 20%. There's not good evidence that those tax concessions change the way in which the total amount people save. They do change where they save it. And so the world you want to move to is a world where we tax all investment income roughly at the same rate. And that inevitably means taxes like the capital gains tax discount needs to rise. But it's not a panacea for housing affordability. You'll barely see it in the numbers.
Right. Just because something is kind of good tax policy doesn't necessarily make it like the most effective housing policy.
But it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Of
and
course.
I think that's one of the challenges in this debate is that if you say you should do this thing, there is a tendency to say, well, that means you're saying none of these other things matter. And we're just saying this thing matters more.
Right. Policy debates are not zero sum. But there is an element of there's only so much political capital, there's only so much that a government can will itself to do during a given term. You've given us, I think, the most compelling discussion of kind of why not focusing on tax changes. Can you now sort of walk us through the logic of centering planning over all the other explanations around housing? Like, how did you get there? What's the most compelling kind of points to put forth?
No, it's a good question. So, the short answer is that planning is the thing. Well, first of all, that supply shortages are the biggest sort of welfare loss that we've got in housing policy. They're the thing that has the biggest impact on people's lives. And over time, they are the biggest driver of why we have unaffordable housing in Australia. And the best way to sort of measure that, like what persuaded me that that's a problem is starting with the work of Ed Glazer, a renowned Harvard economist down, is a series of estimates that showed that when you compare what new housing costs to build, including the costs of acquiring land at current rates, if that housing was legal to be built in an area, and you compare that to what that same housing sells for in the secondary market, there is an enormous opportunity there. As in, like, you could profitably make and sell housing for hundreds of thousands of dollars less, or hundreds of thousands of dollars more than what it would cost you to build it, given prevailing rates of, say, construction costs and everything else. Peter Chulip did that work first for Australia, along with other co-authors at the Reserve Bank and subsequently at the Centre for Independent Studies. And, his work deserves a shout out for moving the conversation forward in Australia. His work was published, I think, the week after we put out our housing report in 2018. And I like to think it is a bit of a coalition of the willing that we both made a big impact. But I think Peter's work was the thing that changed the discussion the most because it focused on the rules. So if you're in a world where housing construction or housing could be built and sold, if it was allowed, for way less than what it currently costs, and that tells you that there's a huge markup, what you might think of or often economists will call a zoning tax, that says that means that housing's more expensive than it needs to be. And so why aren't they taking it? Well, because the rules don't allow you to do it. There are just too few sites where it's permitted to build that extra housing. So those sites where it is permitted are scarce, and so there's a premium. The other piece of evidence that I think supports this is the fact that most of the increase in the cost of Australian housing, the price of it, in recent decades, is increasing in the value of land. This is not a story about construction costs, at least historically. This is a story about most of that uptick in price is because land has become more expensive, and it's become more expensive because while land is obviously scarce, you can't build more of it. You can build more floor space, and that's just what we haven't done.
Yeah, we've made it illegal to kind of substitute in more floor space for less land.
And there's some really good charts. There's a really good visualization of this in a New Zealand report that shows in areas, if you don't allow anything denser than a freestanding home, then the cost of your housing is going to be tied to land values. Yeah. Because for every home, if you say your minimum lot size is, say, 500 square meters, then by definition, the price of a home is going to broadly track the price of land. And as our cities grow, we get there's Melbourne's population of nearly 6 million. So Sydney, by halfway through the century, they'll be 8 million. Land values rise because there's a premium on those locations. Whereas in the areas where you allow more housing, there is basically no relationship between land value and the cost of housing floor space per square meter. So density is the pressure valve that allows a city to continue to provide affordable housing as cities continue to grow.
And in your report, you make kind of a distinction between three problems in planning systems. First, that they kind of say no by default, that approval processes are slow and uncertain, and that governance is biased against change. As Matt Mollman pointed out in his essay alongside yours, bans are more impactful than burdens, right? A fast no is a greater limitation than a slow yes. But it does strike me that you can get some bang for buck by lifting burdens. How do you think about kind of both bans and burdens in the context of your report?
Well, I think what our work shows, because we also do those kind of zoning tax estimates, for every site in Melbourne and Sydney, and I should give a shout out to Cotality that gave us the data for that for free. So they're an affiliate of Grattan in recognition of the support they provided for the work. We basically cycled through every site in Melbourne and Sydney. What theoretically could you build on a site if you were allowed to? Everything from a 2-story townhouse through to a 12-story apartment building. What it would cost to build it, what you could sell it for, above and beyond the sort of developer profit margin and everything else. And, it showed that there was huge unmet demand, particularly in Sydney and in the inner city areas of Melbourne, although construction costs mean that zoning tax is less. So you've got these estimates from us, from others, that show that the cost of the ban is several $100,000 to the cost of housing. We run estimates of, okay, what does 6 months, a year extra delay add to the cost of developing? Because, developers finance, because development is a risky business, the interest rates are high, the return on capital. And, for a 6-month delay, it might be $20,000 for a townhouse development. So instantly you're talking about an order of magnitude less, but you're still talking about an effect that matters. And I think it's telling that until, the late 2010s, almost all the official reports written on this issue all focus on process. They all focus on burdens because, as Matt Mollman rightly points out, if you ask the existing industry what's the problem, they're going to tell you the things that they experience in the industry. And whereas the bans, which is a new provider taking up a new commercial opportunity, you don't even see that in the existing industry is not well placed to tell you what opportunity we're all missing out on.
Right. And that's where modeling every lot and sort of going in, digging in and saying, okay, well, on this lot, a 3-story townhouse would maximize your super profits. You might get 50 grand extra for over and above the cost to deliver it, including the cost of capital in, say, Maribyrnong, whereas it might be 12 stories, say, closer to the CBD or what have you. And you're going through and you're maximizing that, and that's kind of what we consider to be the zoning tax.
That's right. And it's the sum total of all of those different. So previous estimates had sort of just done this for one particular housing typology. We're doing it for all of them. So it's almost like a general equilibrium version of that. But on the burdens point, I think people focus naturally on the delays. And the delays are a big part of it, but they're not the only part. A lot of this is about discretion. So historically in Victoria, and certainly in most other states, the regulatory system gives a lot of discretion to the regulator, whether that be the council, which has got to approve the development, or if it's a state government planning department, to say no. You're being assessed against vague criterion that aren't black and white. There's then, even if the permit gets approved, you've potentially got to get a third-party appeal and you end up at VCAT in Melbourne or the equivalent administrative tribunals. It might be approved with conditions that then, say, lop off a story off the top of the development or require you to do some certain things that are really costly. Through that process, you've got to pay for a lot of different consultants' reports, whether it be acoustics or traffic or, you name them. There's heaps of them. You know more about that side of this process, I think, than I do, Jonathan. So as a regulatory system, the biggest cost is that we ban certain activities that would be highly beneficial, both highly profitable and highly beneficial. But the second part of it is we've designed a regulatory system that looks for one of the most important regulatory functions we have, which is where people get to choose to live and where they work, which looks nothing like the regulatory systems that we have for other important parts of, tax or financial regulation or industrial relations or whatnot. The level of discretion and the uncertainty in the process is just so much higher. And we've just let that regulatory system and the people that run it, which is, largely planners, to get way too far over their skis in what they are controlling in ways that are just really costly to the community as a whole.
Yeah, this kind of comes up and I think is best summarized by the American writer Jerusalem Demzis. Her book sort of on the housing crisis compiles a bunch of her Atlantic essays, one of which is that housing breaks people's brain, right? And when you kind of said that just now, that there are these hugely beneficial opportunities that are hugely profitable, a lot of people hear that and think about greedy developers, taking a bunch of profit, and that upzoning like this is a private sector giveaway. How do you, I guess, make the strongest possible case for the fact that kind of a profitable opportunity can be really beneficial?
Well, we do live in a capitalist society where that has generated enormous improvements in the standard of living in the Western world and now over time in developing countries. That itself is a sign of the potential power of allowing people to grasp profitable opportunities. But you're right, housing is different for a couple of different reasons. One is because one of the key inputs is land, right? And land is in fixed supply. So there's certain economics about how housing markets function that are different to other markets. But the same principles still apply, that if there's a lot of demand for housing, there's a lot of money willing to be put into people either living in housing or investing in it, and then you don't meet that with supply, then prices will rise. And, it is depressing that there is a set of sort of sociological research that asks people, okay, well, what happens if we have a cyclone that wipes out the banana crop? What happens to the price of bananas? Everyone will say it goes up. What happens if we allow more developers to build more housing? What happens to the price of housing? Well, it also will go up, even though you're adding more supply. So new housing is obviously often nicer, or typically it's nicer than what replaces it. That's one of the reasons we want to allow more housing, is to improve the quality of the stock. But it means that particular development will sell more. And that sort of second round effect on, across the whole market, there is now more supply to meet the demand that exists, means the prices will be lower, land values will go down per house or per home or per door that exists, is, I think, just a hard thing for people to grasp. And so it's one of the main things that we try to communicate, is that is trade-offs, that if you allow more, ultimately you get more and cheaper housing.
Yeah. And that comes down to, I think, allowing there to be, like you said, a bit more scrutiny and a larger number of voices in the room. Obviously, this was kind of the subject of the essay that I wrote for Inflection Points. in our opening issue on the problem with urban planning is exactly that there kind of hasn't been a reckoning with these trade-offs and with the reality of these markets. And that there is like a large problem, I think, in having a regulatory sector whose basic premise is that the market that they regulate has failed.
Yeah, there's a lack of curiosity amongst some, or you'd say many, in that regulatory system about the consequences of the choices that they make. And I thought you outlined that really well in the piece you wrote for the first issue of Inflection Points. That a good system will measure the impact of what it does, and there's just a systemic lack of measurement of the consequences of the regulatory system that we've generated. Like the kind of work that we've done, that's the kind of work that should be done by the regulator or by those scrutinizing the regulator. So, we talked before about the three problems. What problem one is that we ban a lot of density. Problem two is the burden, and problem three is the governance. So when it comes to the governance, there's no checks and balances. So there is a basic political economy problem here, right? Which is known for a while, that local councils represent the interests of those that live there already. And if you're going to move into an area, if there's more housing built, your voice isn't heard in that process. But that's not the only area where that kind of problem exists. And the way that's normally dealt with is you also supplement that democratic process with a technocratic process, which is that you say, okay, well, what are the costs and benefits of the choices that we've made in policy? Let's measure them rigorously. It's called cost-benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? No. Is there some other value that we think is important enough that we think that we shouldn't just be utilitarian about this? Okay, that's fine. I struggle to see one in this instance. And that scrutiny of this process has just been completely missing.
Yeah, and that comes down to governance that not only is, institutions looking at institutions, but also as simple as who shows up, like you said, to council meetings. The stark statistic came from Sydney YIMBY, I think, that, 20% of people in Ku-ring-gai are renters, only 4% of those consulted on the government's upzoning by Ku-ring-gai were renters. So.
Yeah, and I see that in our street, right? So I'm lucky enough to live in, a leafy green area of the sort of relatively in the north of Melbourne, say 7 or 8 k's from the city. That area is within 400 metres, 500 metres of 2 train stations, 2 schools, a good shopping strip and a kilometre and a half from a freeway that gets you across the rest of Melbourne pretty quickly. There's a single dwelling covenant on our street. So, this is one of those ones when the development occurred 100 years ago. There was a rule put in place that you couldn't subdivide. When we bought our house, and subsequently when neighbours have sold their homes, all the other neighbours on the street, well, not all of them, but a bunch of them put out these signs that say we will actively oppose any attempt to get rid of the single dwelling covenant, which is code for we will stop more housing being developed here. And, this is a neighbourhood where, it's a lovely area. The people are really welcoming, but I think there's a disconnect between the consequence of the impact of that behaviour on the fact that those that would move into the area if more housing's built, they don't get a say in that process.
Right. And the fact that, this might seem isolated within that given street. Oh, why does it matter if I block it? Why does it matter if I block it? But when there's restrictive covenants as just like one weird piece of like regulation, which we won't bother explaining here, people can look them up. But this one thing covers potentially hundreds of thousands of properties in Victoria.
Yeah, so it's not as big an issue as the zoning controls or the built form controls, but it's big enough to care. It's up there with heritage.
Yeah.
As another area where we've locked up a lot of inner city land. And we should care about heritage. We should care about where we've come from and the stories we can tell about our past. But do we really need to heritage list 50 Californian bungalows in a row that all look quite different already anyway, and half of them have got, renovations out the back already?
Yeah, or do we focus on kind of a few core civic landmarks that people can actually engage with? Because I think, as I've said on the radio before, you only get to knock on someone's door and beg to come inside and look at the heritage once before you get a restraining order.
Well, you get to do it if it ever goes up for auction. Right? That's true. The only time you get to see the inside of a house.
It's true. Open houses are a gift to heritage wowsers everywhere. I think that covers kind of the regulatory landscape that we're at. Rather than ask you too much about the policy prescriptions, I'm going to just tell them they should go read the Grattan Report, More Homes, Better Cities, and your essay in Inflection Points, Planning as a Bottleneck to New Housing. But to sum up, you call for sort of 3 core reforms. First, that there should be 3-story townhouses and apartments permitted across all residentially zoned land. Second, that 6 stories should be permitted around transit hubs and inner city cores, with inner city cores potentially going much higher. And then third, that all of this should be able to be built as of right. So if the criteria is met, you should be able to just build it without having to go through any kind of discretionary planning processes. Why these recommendations? Why did you land here?
The reason we landed there is because, one, it's a substantial increase in permissibility, and that's kind of what has to happen to allow more housing. But within that, it's an increase in permissibility where you can be really confident that the benefits of allowing that increase in permissibility outweigh the costs. So, when we're thinking about planning controls, there are reasons why they exist. There is a discourse that says you could just abolish zoning, right? And I have some sympathy for that, but it's not necessarily a practical thing to say. And so, because planning or built form controls manage things like overshadowing, the impact that spillover impacts that land uses have on neighbours. It's why you don't want to put an abattoir next to a school. Now, why we focus on 3 stories is because the gentle density, so allowing 3 stories in all residentially zoned land, is because that's actually where a lot of the opportunities are, and where governments in Australia are still, outside Victoria, not yet embracing them. So, if you have a 3-story townhouse, and yes, you probably need setbacks if you're going to allow that as of right, so that you're not substantially overshadowing, then you're in a world where from the street, it doesn't look really different to what's there already. If you have the setbacks and little bits and pieces, then it's barely changing the streetscape while allowing substantially more density. So let's say you've got 50 houses on a street. If 5 of them get turned into, 6 townhouses because the blocks are, say, 800 square meters, you have just increased the density on that street by, more than 50%, the population density. And the street still looks basically the same. And there are enormous opportunities to do this. So across most of our cities, Melbourne and Sydney, half of residentially zoned blocks are larger than 600 square meters, so the kind of thing you can build townhouses on. Across Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, it's closer to 3/4, between half and 3/4. I think a lot of people think of the quarter-acre block, which, just by the way, that's 1,000 square meters. An acre is 4,000 square meters. So we haven't been building quarter-acre blocks in Melbourne or Sydney or other capital cities for years.
If ever, when you look back, the quarter-acre block was never really a huge thing in Australia. It was much closer to 600 to 800 maybe.
And now it's more than half of new housing is on land less than 400 square meters, right? The typical, there are various estimates, but new greenfield housing is typically somewhere between 400 and 500 at most. So if you're talking about a townhouse that's on 300 square meters of land, it's not that different to what you can get on the urban fringe. The only people that have quarter-acre blocks in our cities are those that bought them 40 years ago. And as you say, they're often they're more like 800 square meters or 600. The other reason is because it's hard to build at the moment because costs have gone up. Building apartments is really tricky, particularly in Melbourne, but across Australia, whereas townhouses are simple. They are 3 stories, stick builds. It's done by 2 guys, a dog and a ute. To paraphrase the Productivity Commission report that said that the average construction firm size is 1.5 to 2 people.
The half person is the dog, right?
Exactly. That's right. That fills in the extra bit. It's part of the team. And it's also when we saw places like Auckland, which, you would have talked about on the podcast before. Most of what was built in Auckland when they upzoned, they've still got really restrictive planning rules now. It's not a case they have good planning rules. They're the place that made a big change and we saw the difference. That was mainly 2 and 3 story townhouses. And for the cities outside Melbourne and Sydney, where there has been a big focus in those 2 cities on high density activity centres in Melbourne, transport-oriented development in Sydney, in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, for them to increase density, the rules that actually constrain are minimum lot sizes. You don't necessarily even need to go to 3 story townhouses. It's probably 2 story townhouses where you take 1,000 square metre lot and turn it into 4. That's a huge boost to density. That's actually the constraint there. Whereas in Melbourne and Sydney, we're probably at the point now where a lot of the constraints are height.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things you just mentioned there is the idea that we talk about Auckland all the time and we're like, this is great, we should do that. But one of the big things that has happened with, I think, the international celebration of Auckland, and I was over there for the first time a couple months ago, this deep sense that everyone saw reform happen and felt that it was done. And the planning establishment in Auckland said, well, we upzoned already. We're done, right? And I think, we're looking at Melbourne and Sydney in particular, and we'll get to other cities shortly. But when we're comparing these two cities, we see that Melbourne has gone a lot further, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean Melbourne is done, but it certainly means that Sydney is not done. How do you kind of get, and this might come from some experience you've had in other areas of policy, but how do we move kind of this relatively static way of thinking about policy that kind of permeates land use? And how do we get a kind of iterative culture here that kind of says like, no, you kind of have to keep going?
It's about measurement. So first of all, it's measuring what are the consequences of the rules we have today, because that has just, as we've said before, has been lacking. Because unless you have that impetus, you're not going to get anywhere. So a lot of Grattan's work across lots of different areas, and probably should have said at the front, like Grattan is an independent public policy think tank. We're nonpartisan. We've been around for 15 years. It was basically built on the idea of Brookings in the US, but obviously a lot smaller because Australia's 1/10 the size of the United States. A large part of our success is just uncovering problems, saying, hey, these rules aren't working. You could do better. And I think that's what needs to happen on housing and planning. And unless we see that constant sort of push for improvement from understanding how far we are from good policy, then you'll struggle. And I think they've had that issue in Auckland, where Auckland's planning rules look more like Adelaide's than they do Melbourne's or Sydney's in terms of what's allowed. Yes, it's the capital of the country, so there's a bunch of density in the middle of the city. But beyond that, it doesn't look that different to suburbia across cities, the fourth or fifth biggest cities in Australia. And I think it is worth pointing out, the reason we focus on those 3-story or the townhouses is Australia's housing crisis has gone national. Before, you asked me at the start about Sydney's house price in, 2017, 2018. Back then, Melbourne was the second most expensive city in Australia. Now, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide are no longer places people can go to find affordable housing. They're now more expensive than Melbourne, particularly on a price-to-income ratio. Adelaide is, on that basis, the 6th most expensive housing market in the world, which is just insane for a place of 1.5 million people.
Oh, good. I'm glad you didn't make a values judgment about Adelaide.
No, look, I remember going there a few years ago and saying, oh, man, like, if I could do one of the 6 jobs I could do in this state, this would be a great place to live. And the thing is now there's probably 50 jobs I could do, because I could do jobs that previously I would have had to have been in Canberra or somewhere else. I can now do them from Adelaide, and I think that's one of the reasons housing's become so expensive there. But I think the image people have of upzoning means apartment towers, and I think what it basically mainly should mean is, more townhouses on your street.
Yeah, so we've talked about capital cities, and we've covered capital cities here. And obviously the report focuses in on Sydney and Melbourne. This is largely because every state has its own planning systems. It would just be infeasible for a team as talented as yours, time constrained as you are, to actually do the entire country. But let's assume that these reforms would work in Adelaide, in Brisbane, in Perth. What about smaller towns? Ballarat, Townsville, Albury, Wodonga. Like, is there a confidence that kind of this sort of planning constraints are a constraint in regional areas as well?
Yeah, so I'd probably let's flip it around a little bit, which is how big a part of the problem of the housing affordability problem are these things in the cities. Before COVID, I probably would have said, before the pandemic, planning 75% of the problem. Now we're in a world where construction costs have gone up so much, 40% since the pandemic. It's maybe 50%, maybe 60%. So it's still the biggest part of the problem to us. If you're going to regional areas, okay, how big a part of the problem is it there? Well, what's going to determine that is 2 things. One is, what's the demand for the kind of extra demand for housing that exists versus what's supplied? And amongst the things that prevent more supply, how big a part of that story is planning? And I think YIMBY Melbourne's done the best work to sort of map that. Ironically, the planning restrictions are often more stringent in regional areas than they are in the cities. And, I saw a good example of this recently where New South Wales has a dual occupancy policy, and this goes to the question of planners got a plan. There is different minimum lot sizes for when you can access that dual occupancy policy. And in Albury, you can't subdivide anything under 1,000 square metres, right? Whereas in inner city Sydney or middle rings of Sydney, it might be 450 square metres. Actually, I've got to check that up. It might be 10,000 square metres in Albury.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but basically what we're saying is like, yes, obviously in the numbers, these are constraints. And you see this in regional areas as well. It was kind of mean of me to lead you on a question that gets answered with research that my organization produced. But I think there is like the rules that are there are clearly stringent, but they are different, right? Because there's regional land use rules that actually stop you from like putting tiny homes in your paddocks, for instance, and stuff like that. And they're sort of like maybe to curb tourism or whatever. But ultimately what it leads to is these very large underutilized farmlands that can't be subdivided. And it's sort of like similar to kind of green wedge rules, which I don't think your report goes into, and none of Yimby Melbourne's work has gone into that either. But where there are these like substantial de facto minimum lot sizes due to the prescribed use rather than the zone, even though those prescribed uses are zones. It's not zoning in the way that we think about it in urban streets.
Yeah, and I think a missing piece of the policy work in Australia is understanding what the impact of having, what you might loosely call an urban growth boundary or limits on what land can be converted to housing at the urban fringe or at the fringes of our major cities, regional centres, has. So there's been good work done on that in New Zealand that shows that impact is substantial. And I think it's worth being clear that the reason Melbourne has cheaper housing than Sydney is because we've built more apartments in the inner city. We've allowed a lot more townhouses in middle suburbs for quite a long time. And because you can buy a house and land package 30 kilometres from the city centre, whereas in Sydney, you're talking more like 50. And the last of those three is probably the biggest reason. But why has Melbourne got more affordable housing than Adelaide and Brisbane? Well, that's probably got more to do with the fact that we've built more housing close to the centre of the city as apartments than it does, the urban growth boundary. Although we won't know until someone does the work. And it's one of those areas where the work hasn't been done.
Yeah, and watch this space for a later edition of Inflection Points that will, I think, begin to open up those policy windows in the Australian context. We've talked obviously a lot about states. We're doing a lot of state comparison here, and there have been some announcements from the federal government to indicate that there's going to be some attempt by Treasury to kind of internalize some benchmarking and dashboarding of state comparison there, and obviously we're watching that very closely. But your report is kind of an outlier in the land use reform space, I think, so far, in that you don't just propose state reforms, right? You don't just say the state should do this, the state should do this state should do this. A, because doing that for 8 states would be exhausting, but also B, because there are things that the federal government can do. And you guys went into a lot of detail. You went into particular detail in the article for Inflection Points. Why does the Commonwealth matter here when planning is a state responsibility and even a council responsibility sometimes?
Yeah, and it's so the problem sits with states. They are going to be key to solving it. Without state government action, we will not solve this, right? So that's the point number one to make. But point number two is that the federal government can help. And there's good reasons why the federal government should help. One is that land use planning controls and the lack of density have economic consequences. We said at the start, cities are giant labour markets. So if you allow more of this, then you get a bigger economy, and the federal government gets to benefit a lot of that from that because they collect 4 in every 5 tax dollars in the country, 3 in 5 once you exclude the GST that goes back to the states. And so there's been a history in Australia of federal governments paying the states to undertake reforms that are in the national interest, where the federal government will collect most of the extra revenue and is also arguably on the hook more for the outcome. So, it's hard to really pass this, but, I think it's fair to say that when someone gets angry about housing, they don't just, complain about Chris Minns or Jacinta Allen or Peter Malinauskas in South Australia. They're levelling a lot of that at the federal government. And you see that in the fact that the federal government and the opposition compete with each other over who can, give more to first home buyers at elections.
Yeah.
That reflects a policy problem where they are seen as being at least somewhat accountable. So all of that together means that there's a role for the federal government to play both in incentivising the states to solve the problems, which they the states have the constitutional power. And then secondly, and we can come to this, to do more of that analytical work to sort of keep score on how these systems are performing. So on the first of these, we've had a recognition, an acknowledgement from the Albanese government, the federal Labor government, that this is a role that they should play in the sense that they have made an agreement with the states, the national cabinet, to put $3.5 billion on the table to help facilitate the construction of 1.2 million homes over 5 years. Now, we're falling well short of that. The reasons we're falling well short of that could be a podcast on their own, but, a big part of it is the fact that construction costs went through the roof, which means far fewer projects are feasible. Interest rates rose sharply in the first couple of years. We've got something pretty close to a full employment economy, and construction pays below average wages, so it's hard to attract people, particularly for non-skilled trades, which is actually a lot of construction. And you put those factors together, and it's the federal government said, well, we'll pay you states $15,000 per home that you build above, a baseline, 1 million homes shared across all the states. The trouble is they did that at the precise point where the housing construction cycle, because it's a cycle, went into its worst possible scenario for building more homes. And so even any state government that does this, that, pulls out all stops to try to get more housing built, will probably fall short of receiving their $15,000 per home.
Minus maybe Victoria.
Victoria's the closest, but that's partly because the rules have also been set as a share of your existing, they've been split by population, as opposed to, say, by population growth, where Victoria would be expected to build more homes. So it's partly Victoria's doing relatively better, but it's also partly that the way that they did it was particularly unscientific. But the analogy there is, this is not how we reward state governments for policy reforms in other domains. So we have this thing called national competition policy. We've had that since the 1990s, where basically we pay the states, the federal government pays the states for things that they do that are in the national interest. So whether it be creating a national competition policy, whether it be, basically changing their laws in ways that are going to boost productivity of ultimately Australians' incomes. They didn't at the time say, well, we'll pay you for changes in GDP per capita, which is the analogy of what we're doing with housing. And the reason for that is that while we know that planning reform and these other reforms will get more housing built, they'll do it on average over the long term. They don't do it in the short term. Well, you can't guarantee they'll do it in the short term. So if you're writing a contract, you want to write a contract where the states actually get rewarded if they do the thing that they're asked to do, which is politically difficult. Because we should acknowledge that changing cities, our cities changing is a political act. And that's tricky. The idea is to tip the scales in the state's direction to undertake those politically difficult reforms because there's a big payoff.
Right, because one of the things is that planning reform, just due to it happening in a physical, real place, has visible losers or people who are less well off as a result, be it just construction noise at bare minimum, or some change to their neighborhood that just disrupts the status quo. And whether it's worse or better, that change is perceived as loss.
That's right.
And so your kind of thinking is that, well, if we can use the national competition policy, put the money on the table, then the feds are almost kind of giving some amount of cover for the states to be able to do things that would be difficult, if not kind of given the weight of cash-strapped states.
And it's not just like political cover publicly where Chris Minns says, I'm doing this because Albo said that I had to, or I agreed at National Cabinet to do this. It's cover around the cabinet table. So if you're thinking about, do we do this difficult thing where, yes, it will improve affordability over time, it doesn't come at a budgetary cost, but we're going to piss off a bunch of people, potentially, a minority of people within the existing who are happy with the way things are, then if the Treasurer can say, well, if we do this, we get $1 billion, that makes a big difference. And it's worth pointing out here that the Victorian and New South Wales reforms, where they have upzoned substantially, particularly in Victoria, they are popular. So they're popular at a majority level, but the worry is always, are those that are affected, or that perceive themselves as being negatively affected, concentrated locally in ways that mean that certain members of parliament are worried about their seats because they might be on a 3% margin. If 4% of people change their mind, then they're out.
Yeah. So the political calculus really does kind of get affected by local change. And that's where the big problem comes at local government, where that becomes even larger, where, you've got 10,000 voters which means that if 100 people are upset at you, that's actually 1% of your voting base, which is significant because 100 people is not that many. And I have seen, insignificant townhouse developments that have received 300, 400 objections, which obviously is untenable for someone who, wants to retain their council seat. And that's, I take that as an indication that it's the wrong level of government to be making that decision, because the benefit obviously spreads out to many more people than 400.
Yeah, and I would say the politics is changing. In Melbourne, you can probably still say, well, I'm anti-urban infill and still signal that you're broadly pro-housing, because there is still an outside option of you can go buy a house on the urban fringe 30 k's away. In Sydney, you can't anymore. And I think that's why we see, yes, in my backyard, coalitions forming where the Premier and until very recently the then opposition leader Mark Speakman both trying to outcompete each other as who can be quote unquote the most YIMBY. We'll see how that plays out now in New South Wales with a different opposition leader. But I think that's an example where the politics the economics and the problem becomes so dire that the politics have shifted.
Yeah, and you see that as a change to the politics that has emerged from a change in material circumstances.
I think it's probably a fair chunk of it's a change in material circumstances. And then also, I think when we're in a world where we're telling people, like the systems you have in place signal to people what they should value. So if you decide that you're going to have a mini referendum for every planning application for a change in housing in a street, then people will expect that that's what should happen. If you have a system where they don't get that change, and the change that we're talking about is pretty modest, like next door to me, there's a renovation going up where they've knocked down the back of the house, they're building 2 stories. I can see it out my window because it meets the code. We don't have any say in that, and that's appropriate. Whereas if we were given a letter that said, and everyone in the street was said, oh, this is happening, what do you reckon? I think that does change people's behaviour. And I think the former system where it's just like, this is happening, we've deemed that it's not actually having that big impact on you, like everyone just moves on, is the better system that reinforces the idea that our cities are going to have to change.
Right. And it kind of reinvigorates a growth coalition, or at the very least gives the anti-growth coalition less opportunities or fewer opportunities to kind of coalesce around opportunities to stop growth.
Yeah, we've gone out of our way to make it as easy as possible to be a NIMBY.
Right.
That's probably not the behaviour that broadly we want to support across, democratic institutions generally.
Right. It strikes me that it's sort of a bad social contract to sort of say that, well, once you're in the city, you expect the city to remain the same, but you get all the benefits of the city. Right. But the only reason you're getting that benefit is because we built a hell of a city over the last 25 years. Like most of Melbourne's skyline is less than 25 years old. And we're getting enormous dividends from that. And the idea that change would not also happen near you so that other people can benefit. It feels like we need to, and we are in the process via this planning reform. Yes, it's very technocratic. Yes, it's lines on a map. But it is, in a lot of ways, a redrawing of a kind of social contract of how to live in the city.
And the contract is you've got access to all this amazing infrastructure. So if you're in the inner city, trains are really expensive to maintain. It's not just about building them. It's about running them. The tram network, your local libraries, the big cultural institutions that often, a lot of them are in the city, but others are dispersed around. That's an enormous amount of taxpayer-funded infrastructure that you get access to.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's reasonable to say you get to have all of that and the neighbourhood doesn't change around you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the subsidy on any public transport trip in Melbourne is $20 on top of the ticket price that you're paying. These are significantly expensive things to maintain. We should maintain them. But the idea that there's no cost, that there's no obligation of you living near this to also let other people live near this, I think is like a really positive and hopefully like kind of pro-human redrawing of the social contract that I'm pretty excited about.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that change happen in real time. And, if you'd asked me a decade ago, would we be where we are? I would not have thought we'd be where we are now, particularly in Melbourne, where, the Victorian government, we set a set of what was in one newspaper called a radical plan. It's a radical plan that the Victorian government has largely adopted.
Yeah, it's already here in a lot of ways. And Victoria has to their credit, like, yes, there's been a huge amount in the most recent round of reforms, but Victoria has been a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of kind of lifting bans on housing, kind of since probably 2017, maybe 2013, as they kind of rolled in the zoning changes. But of course, things went backwards dramatically in 2000 with Res Code. So it's also cycles of backlash and whatnot. The last thing I want to ask before we jump into the second section, take a quick break, is how do we make sure that this doesn't remain another cycle where there are backlashes, where there are upzonings and then downzonings, upzonings and then downzonings? You know, if we think of property as a build-bust cycle, what about the regulatory growth-degrowth cycle? How do we make these policies really robust? Is it come down to measurement again?
It's partly measurement. So I think we've got some tailwinds, which is that the situation's got to a point where I think people now understand that if we want to have the population of Melbourne and Sydney grow from 5 to 8 million people, which is, you know, that's going to happen almost regardless. Even if you cut off migration tomorrow, the population's still going to grow for quite a long time, and particularly the number of people who need houses because they're adults. I think that's the tailwind. It is measurement. It is YIMBY groups and others telling the story of the trade-offs that we've got here. But I think measurement's the thing that we focused on, that is the thing that's going to make, to avoid backsliding. Because, you know, in other areas of policy, like if you're talking about tax policy or budgets, you know, there's a lot of focus on, you know, is the government running a budget surplus or a deficit? If you have bad fiscal management, it does show up pretty quickly. I always thought, when we started this project, I thought, oh my God, what if the Auckland reforms had been turned off in year one? What if they just hadn't passed? And, you know, those reforms cut rents compared to what they otherwise would be by 28%. They added an extra 4% to the housing stock. These are incredible gains. Imagine if they just disappeared. No one would have known.
Because you don't see it. You don't see what doesn't get built.
Yeah, and we don't. The art of measurement is about measuring trade-offs and counterfactuals. And if you don't measure the counterfactual, then no one can see it, and there's no groundswell of opposition to the fact that something great didn't happen because no one knew what that great thing could have been.
Right, and that really ties together this idea that systemic governance is kind of crucial to not only ensuring that we're making good choices for people who want to live in a city and want to live in the places where they want to live, but also in terms of ensuring that we have robust systems of home building, of development, of creating better cities that are actually accountable to some metrics that we can at least all agree on what those metrics are.
Yeah, I think it's telling as well that, like, you know, I think the think tanks and not-for-profit or third sector groups like, you know, the YIMBY coalitions have been a big part of this story, but it's worth acknowledging that part of this story, the reforms we're seeing in Melbourne and Sydney, came because we created government institutions that started to not necessarily systemically measure the impacts of these policies, but generated a bunch of evidence about the potential benefits of change. So the New South Wales Productivity Commission, Infrastructure Victoria, they've been big drivers of what both governments have done. Where we need to get to is a world where it's less this ragtag group of think tanks and, you know, YIMBY groups doing, and some academics doing this analysis, to it actually being systematized within government. That's the next step.
Wonderful. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back for myth busting. All right, we are back from a game of ping pong in the Grattan basement. Brendan, the response to your report has been, I think, pretty effusive across many domains. But of course, there have been many critics or people who have alternative opinions of how the housing system works, whether planning reform will be effective, and what the actual barriers or the actual perceived barriers to home building are. I want to run through a bunch of these kind of critiques and do, I think, a systematized myth busting. You and I are out there often in the media litigating these arguments. And I think it's probably pretty useful for listeners who are lucky enough not to spend any time on LinkedIn.com to have these ready for the Christmas season. So we'll start with our first myth, which is that nothing is feasible to build. So some people argue, even if you upzone, nothing will actually get built. The numbers don't stack up. Construction costs are way too high. Developers can't make it work. What's your response?
Well, I think that's why we spent several months building a model of commercially feasible capacity for Melbourne and Sydney. So, rather than just sort of saying, well, look, hang on, if we build more than in principle, that if we allow more than in principle, we get more housing. Here is exactly where we can see the profitable opportunities are that are generated out of upzoning, or frankly, going forward, other potential reforms to make housing cheaper to build. It's certainly true that housing has become much more expensive to build than what it was before the pandemic. So, that's true. But what our work shows is that there are a lot of opportunities that become commercially feasible. So as we talked about earlier, we've built this model for every site in Melbourne and Sydney. We've, estimated what the increase in uplift of floor space is from relaxing those built form controls, what it would cost to build all these different housing typologies and what you'd sell them for, right? That was an enormous exercise and something that we hope government will actually pick up and run with. But what that showed is that there are a lot of commercially feasible opportunities that are unpacked or unlocked as a result of these reforms, particularly in Melbourne. So in Melbourne, I think, for an example, we estimate that the changes that the government has already made to allow townhouses across our cities unlock capacity for another 420,000 commercially feasible homes in Melbourne. They're spread across 90,000 sites. To put that in perspective, if the typical residential site is turned over once every 10 to 15 years, that's between 6,000 and 9,000 sites that become available each year that a developer could buy. Obviously, they're competing against a bunch of people who want to live in those homes today, so they're not all going to be bought by developers. But there's a lot of opportunities, and those sites have the capacity to probably build between 30 and 40,000 homes.
And that's the ones available every year.
That's right. And so you add them all up and that's 400,000 extra commercially feasible homes in Melbourne. Whereas in the activity centres, for that denser form of housing, Melbourne has a real problem there, as in it's really hard to get apartments out of the ground in the activity centres. Part of that is because apartments are inherently more, particularly low-rise apartments are a lot more expensive to build. So a 3-story townhouse, as we said before, it's a stick build, 2 guys, a dog and a ute. You don't need specialised equipment. Yes, you might have a concrete slab for the floor, but beyond that, and some steel in there, but you're really using pretty standard construction methods, the kind of thing you expect on the urban fringe. And that's why they're not much more expensive to build than freestanding homes on the urban fringe. Whereas once you get into apartments, you get to 4 stories, you're all of a sudden, you're sinking basement car parking, you're adding elevators, and elevators are expensive, but adding an extra 3 stories of elevator shafts is not. You've got more stringent construction requirements once you go higher. And, the industrial relation system matters too. You tend to have to use more unionised construction labour, and that does tend to be more expensive. You put those things together and there's an uncanny valley, like the kind of housing that urbanists would love to see, which is often 4 to 6 story apartment buildings, that gentle walkable neighbourhood. A lot of that's not feasible to build right now. But 20-story apartment buildings are, because then you're economising enough on the land cost, you're spreading that across so many dwellings that it offsets the fact that it's marginally more expensive to build higher. In Sydney, we estimated that the reforms they've done unlock capacity for, 500,000 extra homes. To put that in perspective, Auckland unlocks zone capacity for equivalent to 100% of the existing housing stock. In Melbourne, they've unlocked capacity for 70% of the existing housing stock. In Sydney, it's about 40%. So those great outcomes we saw in Auckland, we're on track to hopefully get some pretty good outcomes, particularly in Melbourne. But what our work also showed is if you unlock that townhouse development in Sydney, which is something that the Minns government has not done. So they've done a lot of tall buildings. They've not done the other stuff. You unlock capacity for more than 1 million commercially feasible townhouses.
I want to jump in and just get you to kind of define here, because I think something people have maybe a little bit misread or not read deep enough on the report is, I want you to break down what you mean and what the difference is between commercially feasible capacity, feasible zone capacity, and the traditional zone capacity that we typically see, say, councils say about their own plans.
Yeah, so when we think of zone capacity, you got to think of this as a giant funnel, right? At the top of it is zone capacity, which is how many opportunities are there, in theory, to build more housing given built form controls. And that's zone capacity. And what we tend to see is only about 1 in every 100 homes of zone capacity tends to be built every year. That's not an exact number. It's not an iron rule, but it's what we tend to find from the places where we can observe it. Auckland, California, New York, where the studies have been done. Then you've got commercially feasible capacity, which is it permitted to build this extra housing and is it profitable to build? Can you, given land acquisition costs, construction costs of building the thing, the developer margin, which, by the way, isn't just a nice to have. The bank will not lend the money to the developer if the profit margin's not there, right? So it's not just a case of saying developers just cut your margins. The banks won't lend to them. And that's commercially feasible capacity. So it's both permitted and is profitable. And then you've got to think of all these other things that have to happen. Is there sufficient infrastructure? Does the landholder want to sell? Like, say, I might be on a site where you could build 4 townhouses. Do I want to sell my house, or am I happy living there right now? And it's not going to happen anytime soon. Can the developer find the capacity to get the finance, find the workers, acquire the site and strike the development? All those things mean it's a giant funnel that you need a lot of zone capacity at the top to get a little bit of extra flow of new housing at the bottom to meet that demand for population and other sources. So that's what we mean by commercially feasible capacity. And so by definition, when we're saying there's scope for another 1 million extra townhouses in Sydney, it's not some theoretical number of, well, look, if we zone it, it'll get built. It's saying we've run the numbers and it's profitable to build them today if you account for what it would cost you to buy the land, knock down what's there, and build the new thing.
Right. And then we can kind of take this sort of 1 in 100 number as just like a rule of thumb. But that accounts for all the other barriers that there are for developing any given lot. It might be oriented in a way that makes it difficult to build to sustainability standards. It might not have an easy electricity or water connection. There may be some rectification issues on the site that need to happen. Demolition may be too expensive. There are all these kind of things that might be on the margins. That means that in any given year, that 99 in 100 homes won't be there. For starters, of course, the owner actually wanting to sell. But broadly speaking, we can expect that over time, at some point, the marginal home will be able to be built.
Yeah, and what it means as a rule of thumb for governments is if say Victoria wants to build 80,000 homes a year, it needs zone capacity for 8 million homes, right? So that's a lot of capacity.
And that's zone capacity, not feasible zone capacity?
That's right. That's just zone capacity. Now, the better relationship would be to know how much of commercially feasible capacity gets built every year, because obviously that relationship of 1 in 100 to the zone capacity being built is contingent upon interest rates, what shares commercially feasible. And it is clear that if we'd done these if governments had done reforms to planning in 2018, we would expect more housing over the next decade from 2018 than what we should expect today. Because in 2018, apartment buildings were profitable to build in Melbourne. Construction costs were 40% lower, whereas now they're not. But the issue is we don't have enough data really to evaluate the relationship between commercially feasible capacity and the flow of new housing, because no one's measured commercially feasible capacity over time.
Right. Yeah. It's a kind of a deficiency within the governance that we were talking about earlier on the show. Another practical objection that kind of feeds into the cost piece, which is to do with workers. So even if you zone for more housing, we don't have the treaties to build it. The construction industry is already stretched. It's at capacity. Isn't workforce the binding constraint?
It's somewhat of a constraint right now because we are at a world where we're building a lot of infrastructure. We're at full employment. All those things mean that it's hard to find additional construction workers. And so if we upzone or relax planning controls, that will have a bearing on how many additional homes get built in years 1, 2, and 3. But it's unlikely to have anywhere near much of a bearing of how many homes get built in years 5 to 15, because labour markets adjust. And I think that's people typically underestimate how quickly businesses and individuals adapt. We saw this during the pandemic. Like, people adapt to the new circumstance quickly. And so if you have all these incredibly profitable opportunities to build more housing to meet that community need, you should expect more people to end up working in construction. In fact, the construction workforce has risen basically by 30% to 1.3 million, so almost 1 in 10 Australian workers over the last 10 years. So the workforce grows quickly in the long term. And, it's going to take us a decade or to solve this problem.
And Tulip had said this since day dot, is that this is a problem that we have created over the course of decades, right? We sort of did the Australian grade downzoning in the 1970s, so 50 years ago. The idea that, given material constraints, we can do this fix overnight magically, even if the government were to inject infinite amounts of capital into it, is not true. But what we can do is build the system and the regulations that actually set us up to solve it in the fastest amount of time possible.
That's right. And that's why the gentle density is so important, because that's the part of the workforce that you can adapt quickest, because you don't necessarily need an enormous amount of skill to do work on a building site. And it doesn't require a lot of specialized equipment. And that's kind of where you can get more housing built faster. We saw this, in Auckland, where the upzoning there resulted in a big increase in construction productivity, right? So construction productivity rose, and this is Matt Maltman's work at E61 Institute, showing that basically, it was associated with that upzoning was associated with an 8% increase in construction productivity, because you get firms working on better sites. If you have more housing being built, you probably have fewer renovations, which is the least efficient form of residential construction that exists. If you're building an extra story on a site, it doesn't add that much extra time, but all the fixed costs of setting the site up are the same. So all these are, there's reasons that you'd actually get a big boost in construction productivity, which has been going backwards for decades, if you allow more housing to be built, if you relax the planning controls. And in fact, one of my big questions is, we have these big bulk builders that work on the urban fringe like Metricon. You want a house and land package? Here's 25 different designs. They might use 10 different windows. They all come from China and they buy 50,000 of them. They will not work on a site where you have to get a discretionary planning approval, right? So where's the Metricon of townhouses? And that if you have as of right development, where if you meet clear setbacks, my hope is you'll see someone come along and start to do that kind of work. Here are 15 designs. You can get all we can buy in bulk, get all the materials, sign the contract, off you go. And more people can actually sort of basically do the equivalent of building kit home townhouses as, entrepreneurs, where there's someone in the background helping procure all the materials they need.
Right, because it solves this problem where Melbourne has 31 councils and therefore 31 rule sets.
And within that, if you wanted to build in Council X, yes, theoretically it's possible to do what you want to do, but, the council might say, well, you need to change the design in these 6 ways. And that means that the off-the-plan design that, say, Metricon of townhouses has for you doesn't work. So you get innovation from deploying capital and knowledge at scale and systems. And at the moment, we have done everything you could possibly imagine to make that impossible in housing.
Yeah, so one of the answers to where we get workers is through setting up rules and processes that make it easy for people to become workers in the first place in this sector, where there is, as we sort of cleared up earlier, profitable opportunities that benefit society broadly.
That's absolutely right.
Great. Another thing on profitable things that benefit society, or not, as the objection may go, a sophisticated objection. If you upzone an area, land values go up and developers just pocket the difference. Prices don't actually fall. That is one of the models of land markets that kind of gets put out. How do you think about the fact that, upzoning does raise a land value? How do you think about that in terms of, well, we actually want housing affordability, so if a price goes up, how can we get more affordability?
So, it's worth pointing out land is typically valued at its highest and best use. So, yeah, if the best use right now is a freestanding home on an 800 square meter block where the home is 30% of the site and was built in the 1960s, then the land's going to be worth a certain amount. If you then say, hang on, now you are allowed to build 8 townhouses on that site, and instead of having one home that might be worth $3 million, you can build 8 homes that you can sell for $2 million each, right? Or $1.5 million each, depending on what they are.
Yeah, sure. We're going from $3 million up to $16 million.
Exactly. Then the land value is going to go up, right? But what matters here is that land is an input into the construction for production of floor space or housing. And so while the land value in absolute terms will go up, the land input into each of those individual homes has gone down substantially. Because say it is a $3 million house, you divide it by 8, then that land is worth something that's worth a lot less.
$375,000.
Thank you very much, Jono. And so all of a sudden you've made each of those homes are cheaper than the thing that it's replaced. And I think it's worth being clear that when we're talking about luxury housing, quote unquote, the most luxury housing is the housing that is the freestanding home. It's gratuitously using the most scarce input we have to constructing more housing, which is land. And so if you're thinking about housing, you should be thinking about what's the cost per door of the land. And building up allows you to economize on that cost. So whether it's going from 1 home to 8 on a townhouse site, or whether it's going from 8 to 80 or 800 in an apartment building, if you upzone, then the land component will always fall in value, the costs compared to what was there previously. And, when we look in any area of, say, Melbourne and Sydney, in any suburb, apartments are uniformly the cheaper form of housing, not just in absolute terms because apartments are smaller, but typically in terms of per square meters of floor space as well.
Yeah, so we could almost, if we wanted to use a really simple, pithy line, it would be that like the most luxury housing has a luxurious use of land.
I kind of like that. We might use that in future.
Yeah, there we go. We're workshopping live on the air, folks. Like, even if you're, say, building an apartment building that has, $600,000, $700,000 one-bedders, $900,000 two-bedders, and then, let's say, a $4 million penthouse on top, that, is obviously making up some amount of the margins, fixed cost, whatever, that's what's taking out. The thing that is, like, always really important to remember is that the equivalent freestanding house on that piece of land would be a lot more than $4 million.
That's right. And so another way of thinking about it is that there's a certain amount of demand. Demand is kind of exogenous of supply. It's independent of supply. And so there's a certain amount of demand for housing, and we have more, even if what we build is actually because new housing is not new and therefore often nicer to live in than old housing. And that I think people discount just how bad old housing is. Like, I live in a house that's 100 years old. There's a whole bunch of maintenance that I have to do. And, I had to replaster a couple of the walls and took the plaster away, and there was the weatherboard on the other side. There's no insulation. Yes, there are problems with new homes, but they are certainly, on average, way higher quality than what they're replacing in terms of the housing stock. And even if they are expensive, you get this sort of these vacancy chains, which is that there's all this research that says if you build new housing, then pretty quickly it frees up. Then the other housing, the person who moves into that home moves out of somewhere else, and it unlocks opportunities for more people to live in better housing or cheaper housing because the person with the most demand, the most purchasing power, has been soaked up by the new home. And in fact, building more expensive housing leads to cheaper housing for lower income earners than if you just build a bunch of unsubsidized low income housing that's targeting that price point, because you're soaking up more of the demand that's in the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this it's important to, I think, point out that this has been historically the case. Earlier this year, there was a story in Melbourne about a heritage-listed apartment building in St Kilda that, is quite a nice apartment building and, is now a relatively affordable place compared to the rest of St Kilda, which has not built to commensurate densities as this place that we're now so desperate to protect, despite the fact that we won't allow anyone to build anything similar. But when that was built, even though it's cheap now, when it was built, it was much more expensive than the housing around it, largely because it was new. And that's always been the case because, like with used cars, a new house is always going to be slightly more expensive. Let's then go with the critique that goes in the opposite direction, which is developers won't build if prices fall, right? The argument, of course, is that we need to build more homes to reduce prices. But especially given construction cost constraints, developers kind of need these higher prices in order for projects to be profitable. So don't falling prices kill the incentive to build?
The short answer is no. And there's a couple of levels to this. So one is, well, why, if housing's so expensive, why can't developers build more of it? Well, because they have to spend a lot of money to buy the land, because the land sites that are developable, they're scarce. And so the person who actually wins the most from that housing being scarce, it's not the developer themselves. They're just often generating a rate of return but they're having to pay a premium to buy the site from whoever owned that site previously. And if it's in this urban fringe, then it's some farmer. If it's in an in-city area, it's the existing landowner or whoever owned the warehouse or the petrol station or whatever gets turned into housing, right, for urban infill. So if you allow a lot more sites for development, and as we talked about before with townhouses, you can talk about a lot of extra sites. There's no monopoly here. There's no single person that can lock up every one of those, in Victoria, 60,000, 90,000 sites that, you could profitably build townhouses on. Then what you will see is the price of the land that developers having to pay will fall. Have more housing being built at the same time as prices potentially either fall or flatline. So that's point one. Point two is this is a gradual process. So let's say we have upzoned Melbourne. Let's say all capital cities did our set of recommendations, but massively increase the number of permissible sites. Only some of those sites will be built out each year.
1%, let's say.
Yeah, that's right. And so if you gradually see extra housing construction, we only had 2% of the housing stock each year anyway. Let's say that becomes 2.5%. Then after 10 years, we've added an extra 5% of the housing stock. That's enough to reduce prices and rents by 12.5% based on the kind of relationships that economists estimate. What that means most likely is that prices, instead of continuing to rise, maybe they rise more slowly, or they flatline in nominal terms. So like you can buy a house in 10 years' time, transaction at the same price as a house now. If that was the case, then when you compare prices to incomes, it'll have substantially fallen. In fact, if prices remain flat for 2 decades, we would unwind all of the change in price to income ratios that we've seen in Australia since the turn of the century, right? So that's what success looks like. Now, for a developer, the two things that are happening is, one, they buy the land for less. But two, like it is true, and I think where this critique comes from is that developers manage demand, they're exposed to demand risk while they're in the middle of constructing the thing. So they buy the site, and then if prices fall, the risk is, well, life gets harder because you're going to have to sell them for, the thing might be worth less in 2 years than what it is worth now.
Right. The example would be like a permit approved in, say, 2020, then ready for construction 2 years later is subject to construction costs that are much, much higher than their projections. And that, moving in the opposite direction, prices going up or costs going up, is deleterious to the viability of the project.
Yeah, and you can certainly imagine a world where individual developers could get caught out if prices fall. We see this all the time. If the cycle turns, you have a global financial crisis, prices fall and developers are left holding the can.
Yep.
But I think the key thing is that developer might be stuck on that project, but there's a flow of new sites being transacted all the time for new developments over time. And so each developers will be willing to pay less for the land if they expect to be able to sell the thing for less. And everyone's forward looking. So if you expect that you'll be able to sell the thing for either less or the same in 5 years' time when you finish the development, you're only willing to pay a certain amount for the site. And so you'll see this flow through first to land markets the land values go down, and that's what unlocks the ability to continue to profitably develop new homes, even if prices aren't rising.
This is always one of the things that's kind of bothered me about this critique so much, in terms of it often comes from people within the planning sector. This kind of idea that, developers will only build if it's profitable, so we shouldn't upzone anything. But it strikes me that the only reason individual developers, have kind of any amount of bargaining power within the market is because of artificial scarcity, right?
No, that's right. Because if there's lots of different sites, then the existing developers currently at the moment, because there's few sites, they hold something valuable, and that increases the incentives to act strategically. Because you do see strategic behavior. Like some developers will be like, well, I think I'll get a better price for that in 5 years' time, so I'll wait, and the costs of waiting are outweighed by the potential benefit. But if you have lots of different sites, it's a competitive market. You didn't see the market for cars, prices not fall for cars or fall for flat screen televisions just because Panasonic said, we won't be able to sell them for as much next year, so we'll hold out. Well, then Sony just sells more, insert 5 other electronics brands here. And I think I think this is a theoretical discussion, but it's played out practically, right? So empirically we can see in Auckland They upzoned in 2016. The estimates are it's boosted the stock of housing by 4% above what would otherwise have existed. So there's 4% extra homes as a share of the stock today than what was expected or reasonably would have been expected if the planning reforms hadn't happened. It's not as if developers have turned around and gone, oh no, prices were flatlining, we're not going to build anymore. What we see today is a continued increasing wedge between the prices in Auckland and the rest of the country. House prices in Auckland are now 30% lower relative to the rest of New Zealand than where they were at the upzoning in 2016. So we can see that the gains are actually being sustained over time, in real time when we see these experiments play out. So this is one of those examples where we need less fresh economic thinking and probably more adherence and attention to the fresh economic evidence that we're getting.
I think this kind of comes down to really making sure that we recognize that the market is made up by individual firms, right? But we shouldn't focus necessarily on the fact that one firm might hold a property because they don't want to realize a loss. And instead think about, well, it doesn't matter if that firm is immobilized by not wanting to realize a loss, because we have this dynamic market over here that is able to compete for other sites. And therefore, this developer or landowner owner or hypothetical speculator or whatever, holding the site doesn't actually matter in the course of the whole market because people can just go over there.
Yeah, and that developer, it's unfortunate for them that they might be able to strike that development, but they don't lock up. They don't have exclusive non-competes with all of the workers that would otherwise work for them. The workers will flow to somewhere else. The labor and the materials go somewhere else. The finance goes somewhere else to that other developer that's got the balance sheet to be able to develop the site. Now, that process might take a little while, but, you know, this is, again, one of the things, insights from Matt Maltman's piece that he did for Inflection Points, is that you generate new markets and supply chains in a world where you basically end bans.
Some might say that there aren't that many bans, that in fact there are many, many approvals that have been made by councils across Melbourne, across Sydney, across Australia that haven't been built. So if developers already have approvals they're not using, why would more help?
Well, I think, why do we have a bunch of approvals that have not been built? Well, part of that is going to be strategic behaviour, and that exists, right, as we said before, but it doesn't mean that developers get to act as a monopoly and stop new housing development. Part of why we have unbuilt approvals right now is because there were approvals that were given for projects that were predicated on construction costs being substantially lower than they are today. And so those opportunities, those sites are no longer profitable for that developer to build, either because they paid too much for the land in retrospect and they're stuck in kind of a balance sheet problem until they either unload the land and crystallize the loss. And we hear this with the 8,000 apartments that are apparently unsold in Melbourne, of which clearly some portion are being rented out. So there's an income. That's part of that balance sheet adjustment that can take a bit of time. But, you know, I think what we've shown in our work and others have shown is that if you want then to accelerate housing supply, you need to generate more profitable opportunities, right? And I think it's telling that Auckland had an excess of zone capacity, so not talking about approvals that haven't gone through the system, but just the zone capacity, that was more than the existing housing stock of Auckland. And I think it was 150% of it. And that clearly was not enough to maximize the rate of new housing construction to meet demand. Whereas when they increased that zone capacity to the equivalent of 250% of the existing stock, they got a lot of extra housing really quickly.
Great. The last financial point, and then we'll move on to some cultural points and then land this plane. Some people argue that the property cycle is purely kind of a broader macroeconomic cycle. The problem is financial, easy credit, negative gearing, all these elements that basically mean that actually the banks are kind of the core problem and that planning really has nothing to do with that, and that really we should be fixing kind of the rules around lending and the rules around project financing. I think you and I share the view that that is an input, but again, why is that not the key binding constraint here?
Because, well, one thing is we already see a relationship between, say, interest rates and construction. So when finance is cheap, we see more housing being built, right? Why do we see more housing being built? Because there's more profitable opportunities to do that at that particular point in time. I think it goes back to how we measure the problem of planning in the first place, which is there's this huge zoning tax, this huge gap between what housing could cost to build and the premium it could be sold for in the secondary market. So let's say our banking systems and the way they're structured channel too much credit into housing, particularly into the price of existing homes. What that should do is spur an enormous amount of home building, because as prices rise in the secondary market for more homes, then all of a sudden, oh my God, there's all these extra opportunities where it's profitable to build new homes that would basically put a constraint on how much prices are going to rise. And this is literally the world that played out post World War II, particularly in the United States. Ed Glazer's sort of has substantiated this. That instead of seeing a boom in property speculation, we saw a boom in property building, right, in home building, because that additional finance and that sort of unlocking of credit, because you have to purchase a home on credit and you have to build a home on credit. You need finance to get the thing out of the ground, led to substantially more housing. Whereas in recent decades, following the great downzoning of the 1970s in Australia, lower interest rates, more access to credit just resulted in people bidding up the price of existing homes and much less new home building happening.
So let's say we've solved this, right? We've zoned for more density. We have created a banking sector that very easily funds these projects. We've got ample workforce. No one wants to live in apartments. Australians want a backyard, and townhouses and apartments aren't what people actually want.
I think it's fair to say that people would love the quarter-acre block if they could afford it, right? And so there's probably two ways to answer this question. One is to say, well, what to do the kind of work that Grattan Institute has done in the past. You mentioned off the top the surveys we did when you asked people essentially for contingent valuations. Okay, if you ask people, would you like to live in an 8-story, would you like Malcolm Turnbull's house, Mr. Harbourside Mansion, our former Prime Minister, in Sydney, which is worth $1 squillion, would you like to live there? And everyone would say, yes, thank you. But if you say, well, actually, you've got a budget of X, and this is your real-world example, say it's $1 million, would you prefer to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the inner city, a 3-story townhouse in a 3-bedroom townhouse in a middle suburb, or a very small freestanding home on maybe 500 square meters on the urban fringe? And what we see when we ask people those questions is that there's unmet demand, substantial unmet demand in Melbourne and Sydney in particular for apartments and townhouses, right? So that survey is one approach. The better measure is just what are people willing to pay for housing? And you see that people are willing to pay a lot of money to live in apartments and townhouses in inner suburbs, in attractive areas, that exceeds the cost of building those things, which tells you that there is unmet demand. So if you want to know, I think sometimes there's a failure of imagination that we go, oh my God, what if we allowed 30,000 extra apartments in Bondi? Who's going to live there? And it's like, well, all the people who are currently either living 5 k's further out from the city or 5 k's inland from the beach and is spending, $2 million on an apartment in Sydney, they'd be willing to pay that. They can afford to pay that. And if apartments in Bondi were cheaper, because there's more of them, they'd be willing to pay that. So the best measure of the sort of demand curve for housing is who is buying the housing and what they're paying for it 2 k's further out. That's probably the best bet. And so you put that together and you can see there is substantial unmet demand. And it's also worth being clear that the choice is a small freestanding home on the urban fringe on a 450, 500 square meter lot, or a townhouse in the inner suburb. Yes, there are listeners to this that are living in 1,000 or 800 square meter home in an attractive inner city area of Sydney. Like, that's not an option because, one, you're living in that house and, we don't make more land, so not everyone can have that. And 2, no one can afford it. So we're already at a world where Australians will be living in denser housing because if they want to live anywhere near the city, that's really the only option they've got.
Well, if you are living on that 1,000 square meter Sydney block, please email jonathan@inflectionpoints.work and tell me what that's like. We're not making more land. You're right. We can't all afford to live there. But maybe what we could do is we could reduce the population. If we have too few houses, then surely cutting immigration solves the problem. What's your response there?
So look, it's undeniable that if we had lower rates of migration, housing would be somewhat cheaper. Like, it's just a part of demand. Like, it's you can't talk about the high cost of housing and supply without acknowledging the demand. The reason housing is expensive because there's a lot of people who want to live in certain places. And so we've done estimates before that say if you were to, for example, cut the rate of net overseas migration by roughly, say, 30,000 people a year, then over the course of a decade, then you might see prices and rents to be, 5%, 4% lower than otherwise, right? Because obviously it's the flow of migration that matters to change the stock of people in the long term that are here. So it's prices and rents are set by the balance of the demand and the supply of the stock of housing. But it's worth pointing out that that would probably also make us poorer, right? So the typical skilled visa holder, which is most of our permanent program, pays more in taxes than they draw in services over their lifetime to the tune of, say, $250,000, $300,000. Depends on the program, but roughly that's what the numbers we're looking at. That's like a visa holder when you grant them the permanent visa or they think of them as showing up at the citizen ceremony, equivalent of them handing over a check to the government for $300,000, because that's the net present value of the future benefit. And that's setting aside the fact that we see that skilled migration leads to high rates of productivity growth because there's innovation. That's an enormous cost to pay to have somewhat more affordable housing. Now, there are parts of the migration program that we can and should shrink, right? Every migrant is different, and some people make a bigger contribution to Australia over time than others, at least measured economically. And so, Grattan Institute has previously recommended that we should reduce the length of post-study work visas, so how long you can stay in Australia once you've finished your degree, because we see a lot of people struggle. They don't tend to go on to be highly successful skilled migrants through that part of the pathway. Maybe you should have shrink the amount of years they can be here. Or similarly, there are international students that, are unlikely to ever be able to become permanent visa holders. And, should we have such a large number of vet students in Australia studying as chefs or whatnot? So you can still make those choices, but it doesn't negate the fact that if people are out there saying, well, look, if we just cut migration, then I don't have to see my city change. That's just not a realistic proposition. It will make housing somewhat cheaper, and it will delay potentially by a couple of years the fact that those townhouses need to go up in your street, but they're not going to delay it by more than a couple of years.
Right, because Australians are still moving to the cities. They're still forming new households in the cities. Our housing preferences are changing.
Even if you turned off migration tomorrow completely, which would have very costly consequences in lots of ways that people might not anticipate, you would still see the number of households in Australia rising for quite a long time.
Yeah, the simplest way I've heard this put, I think originated at Peter Chillip, which is the substitute for a bad housing policy is not also a bad migration policy.
No, even though there are some migration policies that are better than others.
Yeah, absolutely. And your work on that appears in the Inflection Points article, Moving the Needle, which also is an episode of this podcast. Let's land this ship. The report's been out a few weeks. We've obviously covered a large number of the myths. What, though, aside from the critics, the endless myths around the Australian housing market, what's the response been like?
The response has been really positive generally. I think particularly in the right places. But if I could put it this way, amongst those that probably have the power to decide which way we go, right? And I think that reflects the work that the team put into the work. So, a shout out to Joey Maloney and Matthew Bowes who did that research. I certainly wasn't the one modelling every site in Melbourne and Sydney and working out what's commercially feasible to build on those sites. It's clear that we're also part of a groundswell of research that's coming or that's been coming about the benefits of density. I think the idea that we might need to upzone for more housing is no longer really a radical idea. I think it's now pretty broadly accepted in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago. And the best proof of that is, don't take my word for it, just look what governments have done. They're actually, Melbourne, Victoria, New South Wales have moved. WA is in the process of starting to do their own transport-oriented development. The ACT has relaxed zoning rules to allow more sort of classic missing middle housing, although they've got further to go. We're seeing action across all the states, and that's because I think finally we've woken up to how costly these rules have been, how counterproductive some of those bans have been on more density, and that's why they're being relaxed.
And so let's look forward then. It's 2035. The reforms, similar to what we've seen in Victoria, have gone that little bit further, as you've laid out. There's been success in similar ways across other states. What does Australian housing look like 10 years from now?
Well, I think what it means is Australian cities don't look that in many ways that different from what they do now. If you walk down a suburban street, you'll see of 50 homes, you might see 2 or 3 extra townhouses, right? On that street. If only 1 in every 100 of the zone capacity gets built each year, that's what that looks like. So the changes to Australia's streetscape are pretty modest, but what you would notice is going down any suburban street, you'll see a lot more families, you'll see a lot more kids, you'll probably see more schools, you'll probably see more shops, you probably might see fewer cars, or at least, maybe a few more cars, but
Fewer cars per person. More cargo bikes, Brendan Coates?
Well, look, as someone who's an aficionado of that, hopefully, yes. I think that can only be a good thing, and I would happily write a 7,000-word inflection points piece on that issue alone.
We'll consider it.
We'll take that in an editorial review. But I think Australian cities both don't look that different when at first glance, but socially become quite different because housing has become more affordable. People can live where they want. They can realise the lives that they want to live. And that crushing constraint of unaffordable housing in Australia, hopefully we're talking about how house prices haven't moved in a decade.
Wonderful. And that's exactly what I think substantiates the claim you make within the report, which is that this is an endeavour, the same scale of the great macroeconomic forms of the past. That's exactly the kind of vision that we want to see. We have a final question that we always do on this show, which is, what's one thing that you think more people should know about how Australia works?
Australian political culture and economic culture underappreciates the importance of insurance. So Australians are exposed to a bunch of risks that often you're not exposed to in other countries. So one of those is that we have variable rate mortgages, so that it is, it's normal in Australia that the Reserve Bank announces interest rate decisions, and all of a sudden the cash flow of, millions of Australians changes overnight. And, and we saw in the post, COVID inflation spike, which can change in really material ways. But it also applies in other areas. Like Australia is one of the few countries that doesn't have a contributory unemployment insurance system. So we have a really low rate of job seeker unemployment benefit. But, you're much more exposed to the risk of job loss in Australia than you are in other countries. Our super system doesn't have the kind of insurance for longevity risk protection that you see elsewhere. So like most countries have a world where, your income in retirement lasts as long as you do because they had defined benefit pensions, whereas we've shifted to what you call a defined contribution system. So where you get out what you put in. So however well the stock market does over your life determines kind of what you have at retirement. And then you are responsible for managing that over the course of your retirement. And we've done work on that showing that is incredibly challenging for retirees. It's one of the reasons Australians don't spend.
It's kind of an impossible actuarial problem.
That's right. So William Sharp called it the hardest, nastiest problem in finance. So you put these things together, I think they're indicative of a culture and an approach to politics and policy design that I think there's something about the fact that we don't teach anywhere near as much about social insurance markets in policy design in Australia as we do in a lot of other countries.
Thank you so much for that, Brendan. Thanks for the excellent podcast, and talk to you very soon.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you for listening to the Inflection Points podcast, a production of Inflection Points Publishing, including me, Jonathan O'Brien, as well as Ethan Gilbert and Manning Clifford. Our music is by Isha Ramdas, who also provides additional engineering support. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.